Well, welcome everyone to this Open Cambridge event. I'm going to be introducing in a moment our guest speaker, Dr. Annie Gray. Annie is an historian, a writer, a cook and a broadcaster specialising in the history of food. She is a regular feature on TV documentaries such as The Victorian Bakers and The Sweetmakers, and is the author of The Greedy Queen, Eating with Victoria. But her latest book is Victory in the Kitchen, a brilliantly well-researched work about the life of Churchill's cook, Mrs. Georgina Landemare. And what I like about this book is that it works on so many levels. You could call it a multi-layered cake. It's a fascinating biography of a woman who lived a life in service of a type that has now vanished, but who was nevertheless a strong, independent woman and an expert in her field. The book also sheds important light on Churchill, his domestic arrangements and his dinner diplomacy. But it's also an amazing work of social history, revealing the huge changes in British society over the last century through changes in food preferences, practices, cooking styles, and so on. So without further ado, let me introduce Annie Gray.
It's really nice to be here in the Churchill archives, the scene of so much glee and also, I have to say, so much frustration. What I want to do today is to talk about Churchill, his foodways and his cook, Georgina Landemare. The talk is based on research for my book, Victory in the Kitchen, The Life of Churchill's Cook, but I've already given a talk on that here. So what I want to do today is to dwell really more on the archival side of things, so the stuff that I learnt here in this room, and the way in which the Churchill archive was so fabulous in building together a picture of Georgina Landemare's life, but also of her relationship with Winston and Clementine Churchill. The man himself. Winston Churchill has quite a reputation as a glutton and an alcoholic, neither of which are entirely untrue, it's got to be said, although he was a fully functioning alcoholic, if indeed he was one, and as for his gluttony, it's been over-exaggerated. Churchill was an Edwardian, and that's one of the key things to remember throughout any form of study of his life, and it's certainly one of the things that came through very, very vividly in the archival research here. He was a man who enjoyed food and enjoyed good food, and he was also a man who knew how to use food. So throughout this talk, throughout my book, throughout any form of research of Churchill and his dining habits, there's always two strands. One is that he's an Edwardian aristocrat, brought up to eat certain foods and to live a certain style. And the other is that he was a very canny politician who knew well how to use food and dining as a means of networking and indeed as a means of showing off, building his own image. I'm sure that everyone who is watching this talk has heard things about Churchill building walls and being a man of the people. Well, it also helped his image that he had a reputation for liking Irish stew and drinking just a little bit too much. Very much man of the British people. So, turning to the archive. When I wrote the book, I think I was a little naive when I started. Georgina Landemare, cook to Winston Churchill, his longest serving cook. There's bound to be loads of material on him just down the road in Cambridge. How difficult will this be? Yeah, really difficult it turns out, because one of the natures of any archive is that selections have been made in terms of what's been saved and what's there. So while I naively thought every single scrap of domestic correspondence would just be lying there for me to pick up and turn over, that's not quite the case. Much of the archive is, as you would imagine, political and concerns itself with the big questions that you've all read about time and time again. Less of it is concerned with servants, with food, with menus and with household bills. But that's not to say it's not there. One of the joys is to look over personal correspondence between people who don't necessarily know, at least at the point when they're writing, that their lives will be pored over and dissected in quite the way they have been, although the later letters arguably are not quite like that. So here you can see personal correspondence from the archives. A letter from Clementine Churchill talking about the fact that she's eaten plover's eggs and had a great seasonal meal. And then over there on the far side, a letter from Winston Churchill back back to Clementine asking her to send him a food package from the front when he was there during the First World War. The personal correspondence between the two has quite a lot of food in, but frustratingly no long menus or this is what I ate and this is how I ate it and this is who cooked it and this is what we did and these were the plates, which is kind of what I was hoping for. You don't get any of that, but you do get references to food and you do build up a real impression of a couple who liked food, who ate a lot of it, and where food was part and parcel of their everyday conversation, much in the same way that it is for a lot of us today when we text or email or WhatsApp or whatever, or indeed if you just go onto Instagram and just look at it, where I would say 90% of it is food, although that might also just be me, because for other people I suspect it's cats. You also get a picture of the relationship between the Churchills and their servants. You can see up there, Stuart came in at luncheon with a white face and said, "Please, Mum, I think the new kitchen maid is mad." That's from a letter which is brilliant because the kitchen maid was indeed perhaps suffering from temporary insanity and chased the cook round the kitchen with a knife. So there are little things that come out of the letters that are very interesting and that do start to build up a picture of everyday life, if not full menus. For slightly more detail, you need to delve into the domestic lives a bit more to look at bills. Now, Churchill was and is notorious as somebody who always spent more than he earned. So if he was given an advance or promised an advance of, say, £2,000, he would immediately spend £6,000 and then the advance would be dialed back to £1,000 and he would be in debt. All of his correspondence and many of the bills show this kind of level of retrenchment constantly happening, but they also show quite how much was spent on often surprising items, whether it's Danish bacon or Dundee cakes. You really do build up a picture of the kind of things going into the household. Not a complete picture, but taken together with lots of other sources, you can start to see the kind of things that were being eaten. And there are some rather wonderful things. There are bills, for example, for restaurants, including the Savoy, and for caterers, including Gunter's, which show that the Churchills were regularly using outside caterers rather than relying on their own cooks, and that in keeping very much with people of Churchill's class, they were entertaining at restaurants. We have this idea of people in certain political classes always entertaining at home. But ever since the first really world-class restaurant opened in Britain in 1889, restaurants have been a real focus for people who want to entertain. You only need to think about the business lunch today. And the Churchills were no different. So you've got things like, this is the Churchills Grill Rooms account letter, and it's also querying a bottle of whiskey, I think it was, and some oysters that there was a lot of bill querying going on. You also start to kind of see a little bit under the surface. So while the Churchills were projecting this idea of themselves as political gurus, entertaining at Chartwell, putting on a good show, there is a growing sense of panic by the time you get to the 1930s. So over there is an advert from the Irish Independent, experienced single-handed kitchen maid, used to large country houses, wanted for Kent. This goes together, and the only reason I found it was because it goes together with a bill, again in the archive, which just says payment to the Irish Independent for adverts. So once you trace that down, you can start to cross-reference and really get this build-up of a picture. The wage there, incidentally, is all right, but not amazing. And they'd advertised the week before for a cook as well. So this was a point where very clearly the Churchills were retrenching. They were hemorrhaging staff at that point. One of the things that really comes out of the bills in particular is the fact that they could not retain staff. This was a constant theme all the way through. Constant payments to agencies such as the Regina Agency and Mrs. Massey's and Mrs. Hunt's. These are all well-known servant agencies at the time. Things that you'd pick up on, I suppose, only if you knew what they were because they're passing references, but that's the same with any field of research. But you can see that they could not retain staff. And some of that is explicable by the way in which they term their staff. The tall kitchen maid, the blonde one. Very rarely do Clementine and Winston use the actual names of their staff when they're corresponding with each other, which, given they normally only had 6 or 7 people in place at either of their homes, does seem sometimes a little bit rich. I suppose what I'm getting at is that searching through the archives gives you a picture of a household. It gives you a picture of a very rackety household. But when you're trying to write a book, you're kind of looking for more than that. You can say, well, this is how it worked and this is what they did and give some good examples, but after a while, you're just looking at lists of stuff and nobody really wants to just read lists of stuff. But just the occasional thing swims forth to give you a really kind of wow moment. For example, here is a letter from the Hotel Ritz in Paris saying, here is the recipe that you requested, Mr. Winston Churchill, for consommé madrilène. Madrilène is a chicken consommé which is flavoured with tomato and celery and has bits of pimento in it. It's quite an upmarket soup, it's very classic of the time. So clearly Churchill was interested enough to ask for the recipe, which goes, of course, really well with everything we know about Clementine, who really did know her way around a kitchen. She knew how to cook, and her mother had written a cookery column for the Daily Express. When you start to put that together with other things like bills for cleaning the range or for fridges, all of them labelled as to which house they're for, and then you put that together with the surviving archaeology, that's where you really do start to get something that's a lot more solid. So that's the kitchen over at Chartwell, and that's been set dressed for the 1930s in line with Clementine's wishes. Looking at that range, you look at it and think, gosh, doesn't it look lovely and new with those 1950s stainless steel pans on it? But we do have in the archive bills for the range being cleaned. We have a bill for a frigidaire de luxe, which goes into the house. The cook has to be taught how to use the fridge. So there's a bill for someone to come out and demonstrate the fridge to the cook. And then later on in the 50s, another fridge goes in. And again, from those archival references and from those letters, we can see that the second fridge was destined largely for keeping wine in. So I personally found it quite cool that Churchill had a booze fridge, but that might just be me. There are also things like this. The cook is going. She sent in her spoon and her ladle on her own account. I'm very glad. She had the knack to the highest degree of making all the food taste the same, and that not particularly good. I subsist on soup which Margaret makes for me secretly in London. It is delicious. Now that one, in one of the letters from Winston to Clementine, sent me off on a chase to find out who Margaret was. Margaret was referenced in several other letters as well. You take the name, you put it together with electoral records, you put it together with the 1939 register, and slowly you can see that there was a cook called Margaret. Brilliant. Well, that's one thing. Who was the cook at Hyde Park Gate, and you can trace her career forward and backwards and see where she came from, and therefore see the kind of people that the Churchills were employing, who were not brilliant, it's got to be said. If you're really, really wealthy at this point, you still employ, if you can do, a male cook, or at least you bring in a jobbing caterer from time to time. And well, the Churchills did, but very much the standard of their everyday food, you start to think, might not have been as amazing as perhaps it could be. Enter Georgina Landemare, the main subject for my book. Now this is not in the Churchill archive. This is Georgina's manuscript cookery book, which she started, as you can see, in 1936. And there she is as a young woman and then as a slightly older lady with her husband, Paul Landemare, who was a French chef. The reason I'm showing this is because of the handwriting, because this is a kind of classic of any form of archival research and was the cause of a proper epiphany moment here. This is her book, written in her handwriting, the very kind of characteristic copper plate. Very beautiful handwriting from someone who was born in 1882. Now, by the point I came to the archive, I had already researched Georgina's life up to the 30s. So she'd been born, she'd left school at 12, she went into kitchen, she was a scullery maid, kitchen maid, cook, so on, so obvious. Got married to a French chef 25 years older than her, had a child, survived the First World War, went into catering with him, so as a jobbing cook, just doing here and there, days here and there. And then he died in 1932. She started her cookery book. She also worked for the Churchills that same year. Now, I didn't know that at the time. I was trying to find out when on earth she'd started working for them. I knew she'd worked for them in 1940, but the bit in between was a bit of a blank, it has to be said. Until Paydirt. And we're going to look at this more closely in more detail in a moment. When I said there were no surviving menus, well, there are very few surviving menus. A household like the Churchills would have had a menu book for every single day. And Mary Soames, Mary Churchill, later Mary Soames, in her memoirs and her autobiography, talks about secreting herself under the bed in amongst her mother's underwear and hearing the daily conference with the cook, when the cook would bring up the menu book and Clementine, still in her curlers, would go through and annotate it. This is one of those menu books. And it's a really tiny little book, 1936, 1937, and you can see in there the daily menus for the family, not for the servants. And it confirms all of those impressions that this is a family who were not eating particularly well. So you can see on there, luncheon was Irish stew, greens, potatoes, lettuce salad and an apple pudding, while dinner was chicken soup, sole filleted, roast chicken, bread sauce, maitre d'hotel potatoes, which is just potatoes with a lemon juice, butter and parsley dressing, leeks, another lettuce salad and lemon curd tartlets. Pretty typical, to be honest, of an upper middle class family, not so much lower gentry. Elsewhere in the book, there are things like a butter sauce with breadcrumbs, or there are baked beans from time to time as well. It's a family who can't quite afford to live as they want to. But what happens is that at one point in that book, and I'll show you that in a minute, as you flick through the pages with that cook's very unformed writing, suddenly you come across Georgina Landemare's copper plate. And the moment when I did that, sitting here thinking, when's Georgina going to turn up, was a moment when I just thought, I can do this. I can write that book. So for anybody thinking of doing archival research, or anybody who's eager to know more about what it feels like is desperately awful until the moment when you recognise your cook's handwriting and you know it's all going to be okay. Honestly, you cannot make up the level of happiness that I felt at that point. And then it gets even better, because this is one of Clementine's appointment diaries. Again, a document that I suspect for most researchers would be entirely useless. I mean, who cares when Clementine Churchill was getting a manicure or getting her hair done, which is largely what a lot of it is about. But I cared, because when you go through this, if you can read her handwriting, which is not always obvious, there are little annotations such as Minnie off. Minnie was the cook who Georgina was replacing. There are annotations such as Mrs. Landemare, which you can see up there on January the 5th, clearly a weekend when Georgina was catering. There's even an annotation in October for the train that Georgina got in on at Westerham Station. All of that, that's kind of magic, and it does give you a real shiver down your spine when you look at that and see the everyday lives just laid out. Not the great, the amazing, the wonderful, but just lives lived on an everyday basis. Now, one of the questions that I normally get asked whenever I talk about Georgina Landemare is how the Churchills managed the ration. There's an idea that perhaps they bent the rules or even broke the rules, or an idea that they kept to the rules. Well, none of those are entirely true. I would argue that everybody was slightly bending it, or at least they were following the kind of spirit of it while doing what they could do to get around it. And I would also argue that the Churchills did not at any point break the ration. But if you were Mrs. Smith living in, say, Thetford, and you had quite a lot of rabbits, and you knew your friend Mrs. Jones, who lived up in Ely, and she had a really good vegetable garden, of course you would swap. You would swap some leeks for some rabbits. And perhaps your friends would send you some gifts. So you have someone who's got a lot of pheasants on their land, and they send you a couple of pheasants and you send them a rabbit. This is what happened with the Churchills, except for the bit where he sent anything back, but arguably, you know, he was running the country, so that was kind of giving back in itself. The difference was that Churchill's friends were not Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones. They were the King of England and the President of the States. So the stuff that he was getting was somewhat better than rabbits and leeks. Here's the basic ration out in the middle. And the way it worked was you'd go along to get your ration and you'd have your ration book and you would have certain things allocated. You still paid for them, incidentally. This wasn't a free-for-all. So you'd get your 1 shilling and 6pence worth of meat and your 2 ounces of tea and your 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of marge, 2 ounces of lard, so on and so forth, and it fluctuated. If you lived in a large house with lots of servants, as Winston and Clementine Churchill did, the ration books would be pooled. And that is obvious in the archive because there's a letter saying we're going to pool the following ration books that Georgina Landemare will have charge of. So there are 12 ration books, 12 people's rations. In addition to that, there was the point system, and that meant that you could choose tinned goods for differing numbers of points. And in addition to that, there was the stuff that wasn't rationed. Plover's eggs were not rationed, believe it or not, because there was no way to guarantee the supply. And yet, plover's eggs there were. A letter from Churchill to his cousin, "Thank you, dear Bert, for the plover's eggs and for your letter." Venison, also not rationed. Couldn't guarantee the supply, very seasonal, very much associated with the wealthy. The Prime Minister has received some venison from the King, for which Mr. Churchill is very grateful indeed. Perhaps he would tell His Majesty what pleasure and gratification it has given Mr. Churchill to receive all these delicious and most welcome presents from Balmoral. Or what about brandy? We believe that there was at one time a question of a quotation, but quite candidly, we would be more than pleased to have the opportunity of presenting a case. Well, of course you would. Or peaches. The Prime Minister has asked me to convey his thanks for your kindness in sending him a box of delicious peaches. All of this is completely normal. It's exactly what was happening with the working classes, the middle classes, and Winston Churchill. It's just that his stuff was better than anybody else's. It's just that he was being sent 30 eggs from school children, while down in London people were complaining that their 1 egg a month was off and therefore they couldn't use it. But it's just really a matter of degree, isn't it? And Georgina was very well known for being able to really make that ration work. One of the ways she did it becomes obvious when you look at the later menu books. Again, there are menu books for a brief period after the war, 50s. And there you have menu books for both the servants and the family as well. So here again is Georgina's very, very characteristic handwriting. And this one you can see is a book for the servants, and this would be at Hyde Park Gate. One of the things that comes through in these books is the way in which the ration was managed. Powdered egg, absolutely one of the nastiest things you can ever eat, without any exception, certainly in terms of my experience. It tastes of sort of wet carpet mixed with sulphur. I don't recommend it, but it was a staple during the war years. The servants got the powdered eggs. Upstairs, fresh boiled eggs, beautiful peaches. Nothing illegal, nothing dodgy, everything to be expected. But it's a really obvious way in which Georgina helped to manage the ration. You see as well very graphically in these books things like the use of leftovers. So if a roast joint is served on a Sunday, it's served to the family and then those leftovers are eked out for the servants, but not in your kind of classic bubble and squeak or hash way, very much in much more creative ways. You see the changing march of technology as well when you look at these menu books, not just in terms of the fact that one of them suddenly has a biro involved, but also because Georgina's using cremola pudding and sago, tapioca, couscous. And again, those things are reflected in other sources. So one of the things that happens is that after the war, Winston Churchill is sent a lot of stuff from a lot of friends. Frozen turkey for Christmas, a bag of couscous, random Australian tinned meat comes in as well. Things sent from friends, things sent from well-wishers, things sent from complete strangers who just sent him some raisins saying, "Dear Mr. Churchill, you saved the world, have some raisins." And Georgina cooks all of those and makes the most of everything that's sent to them. And these are absolutely invaluable if you're studying the way in which the Churchill's household worked, not just in terms of what they ate, but also in terms of servant hierarchies, who was there, what was happening, all those kind of things. Of course, the archive's not everything. There are many sources outside it. These, for example, are pictures of Georgina Landemare's food from an article that she wrote for Woman magazine in the 1950s when she published her own cookery book, Recipes from Number 10. So you can see up there, I think that was a gâteau mousseline, gâteau de something, Dutch, I think. Anyway, it's a sliced sponge cake with different colours of jam in between it. It doesn't really do it justice in black and white, it's got to be said. Bottom is the jellied consommé that Churchill always had before he went to bed. A rather delicious looking dish up there of kidneys, and the one in colour is Boodle's orange fool, which, in contrast to the aforementioned powdered eggs, is one of the most delicious things you can possibly eat. It's also really lovely when sources come together and complement each other. And one of the best examples of that is the notorious bomb story. Now, Churchill in his memoirs wrote about the bomb that fell near Downing Street. Very, very close. It smashed the windows apart. It was terrible, but he, in his own words, had a premonition. So he went down to the kitchen where Mrs. Landemare and her kitchen maids were working without turning a hair, and he ushered them down to the shelter, and down they went, and he saved her life. Her rendition of the story, which she told the BBC in 1977, is slightly different because mostly she was concerned with the pudding that she had boiling on the stovetop, a mousseline pudding, which you can see the recipe for up there. It never found its way into anything that she published. It's beautiful, but it is also light as air, and as she said herself, the wrong time and it's ruined. So her focus was entirely on the mousseline pudding, and apparently every single night she had to be ushered down to the shelter. Her reaction to the whole, "He saved my life," was, "Yes, he did, but my God, the rubble." So when you listen to those two stories together, you do really get different perspectives from upstairs, downstairs, Churchill's own view of himself as a sort of all-saving God, and Georgina's rather more prosaic view of herself as doing her job below stairs. But it all comes together and it's all rather fantastic. The other thing that's really lovely about the later archive, or rather the archival bit that covers Georgina's later life, is that finally there's some material. Up to this point, it really was a question of kind of wresting material from all sorts of places, and all of a sudden I was rolling in material. It was really obvious that Georgina became a real friend of the family, in as far as a servant can be a friend of people who are, let's face it, by that point kind of feted by the whole nation. So here you've got the joy that is the Mary Soames archive, which is one of the best things I've ever read. I spent hours with her diary, not for any reason other than the fact that it was just such a pure, unalloyed joy to read. Dear Mrs. Landemare sent up kippers and coffee, also honey and butter and toast, which I resisted. I have attacked my vigour with vigour and considerable success during the last month, to my great joy. And so on and so forth. Mary and Georgina clearly formed a really strong bond. Georgina taught Mary to cook. She gave her one of Paul's cookery books that Paul had given to her, and the whole thing is really lovely to read, quite frankly. What is slightly less lovely is the fact that Georgina's pension was really miserly and never went up, despite the fact that inflation was rampant and the cost of living went up, something which Georgina's children complained bitterly about. Mary Soames also did quite a lot of research for her own book on Clementine and her own books later on the Churchills as well. And from that, there's also quite a lot of interesting stuff to be gleaned. So Mary wrote out a list of all of the cooks, and you can see on there, Mrs. Landemare retired 7th of January 1953, and then finally in 1954, which was the first clue I had that Georgina failed to retire very well. She kept coming back. Then you've got Mrs. Urquhart, Mrs. Krasny, Mrs. Landemare returned to London from May, and so on and so forth. So you do get you get this just brilliantly vivid picture. The other thing that this cleared up was one of my awful moments. I decided to call up one of those later menu books to have a look at, to reassure myself that things were going to get easier. This was in the wake of my absolute euphoric moment finding Georgina's handwriting. And I opened up this book from 1954, and it was in a kind of Denglish, a kind of German, I would say, in fact. And I thought, what on earth is going on here? This is the man who has just guided Britain through the Second World War, and these menus are in half German. And it turned out that they were employing Swiss au pairs because they were really, really cheap, and Georgina was training them up, and hence the fact that they were writing things in what was clearly German handwriting and in this kind of garbled Denglish. But these are the kind of pitfalls and joys and frustrations and wonders that you find when you're researching. That concludes this part of the talk. I'm going to take you over and have a look at some of the documentary sources in more detail now. There's Churchill in all his glory, holding forth about something or other. And I should also note that the book that I wrote, Victory in the Kitchen, you can order signed, and if you want, dedicated copies from Toppings of Ely. They are primed and ready and waiting. So I hope that you want to read it or have read it already. And if you did, loved it. And if you didn't, do love it. Thank you very much.
Well, Annie, thank you very much for that amazing presentation, and welcome back to the Archive Centre. And it's a real pleasure to show you again some of the material that you used for your book. And of course, you were talking about how Churchill was an Edwardian, and started with that. And here we have some of his Edwardian bills. So this is when, of course, he's on the rise politically. This is 1912. He's First Lord of the Admiralty, and at this stage, he's clearly living pretty well, isn't he?
Well, he's living beyond his means, but that's normal. But I mean, straight away you can see champagne jumping off the pages here. It's really lovely to see these because I studied them on the computer catalogue, so only in black and white, this big. So to see them like this, with the stamps on as well, is just absolutely fantastic. But I mean, you've got Fortnum & Mason here in Kingston Miller and Company, private caterers and ball furnaces. I mean, it tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it?
It does, and they're very much of their time, aren't they? I mean, I love these sort of very visual headers that you get.
I think they're brilliant. I mean, this one's even got a map on it, which is fantastic, just in case you didn't know where, and I'm kind of like, presumably you shopped there, but then I suppose you didn't. You sent your servant, or you just sort of telegrammed in or wrote in or phoned in to get your order in. I mean, what is this one? Providing dinner as per menu, approved. Also dessert, fruit, floral decoration of the table, use of tabling, chairs, all best quality requisites for service. The attendance of full staff of waiters and others, wines and champagne, Paul Roger, of course, and Perrier Jouet 1904, sherry, port, claret, hock, spirits, liqueurs, mineral waters, etc. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of money as well, £106 and 10 shillings.
It is. I mean, before this conversation, I went and consulted David Locke's book, No More Champagne, because in that he gives sort of indexes that give you the sort of contemporary amount. And to get the sort of contemporary equivalent of that, you have to times by 90. So this is a dinner costing sort of £9,000 or so, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say the wage of a cook at that point was probably around £30 to £40 a year. So this is, yeah. I think that's why modern equivalents don't always work, because £9,000 today wouldn't be equivalent to double the wage of a cook. But at that point, you're looking at something which is absolutely extraordinary. But then, you know, he's a man who wants to have a political career. He's already built up a certain amount of standing. His mother built up a lot of good standing through dinners. I mean, she employed Rosa Lewis, who is the major female caterer of the time and one of Bertie's favourites, the King Edward VII's favourites. So, you know, he knows the meaning of food and he knows what to do with it. What's the other one? Oh yes, 6 bottles of invalid turtle soup.
Not something you could get now, I don't think.
No, I think probably the fact that turtles are endangered would stop you buying invalid turtle soup. But yeah.
And then one of the points that you made in your presentation, of course, was that by the 1930s, this is a lifestyle that really the Churchills are struggling to maintain. And I think perhaps you can see that sort of visually in the change in the style of the bills that you get, because you go from these wonderful Fortnum and Mason accounts to, in 1938, them sort of shopping, admittedly for their more daily routine, at the Army and Navy stores.
Yeah, but I mean the Army and Navy stores was renowned. It's not quite a supermarket because such things didn't quite exist, but it's a big dark building, no windows. You go in, you present what you want, and then it gets delivered to you and you settle your account. It was, you know, it was, as the name suggests, for anybody who'd served in the forces. But at that point, of course, post First World War, that kind of meant an awful lot of people, so that it was hardly unique. And you can see on here they're buying New Zealand chops, or New Zealand meat was much cheaper than British meat because it was brought in frozen and then sold defrosted. Kippers, middle end, mutton, fowl. This is not high-end stuff, self-raising flour. Why would you do that? Although 5 siphons of Schweppes water to go with their gins in the evening, that's not too awful, is it? And it surprises me as well that they're buying quite a lot of fruit and vegetables, given they had Chartwell, which was quite prolific. It was quite good. But I mean, of course, at this point, Winston Churchill was out of office. Yes, he was very influential and he really needed to put on dinners that would be sort of focuses for attention, but he didn't have an awful lot of income coming in other than from his books, whereas at that point, of course, he was the up-and-coming man. So, and here, yes, these ones are the adverts for the servants, aren't they? Yeah, so you get these really tantalising glimpses of names of people that would have worked for them. So E.R. Phillip, job cook, it's just a jobbing cook. But, you know, how long she worked for them, whether she came back or not. At one point, I think there's a licence for a male cook that they get granted, which, no idea whether he ever turned up. And then this is the bill from which I managed to find that advert for the Irish Independent for when they were advertising for cook, housekeepers and kitchen maids as well.
So how lucky were they to get Mrs. Landemare, and would they have got her, in your opinion, without the Second World War?
Very lucky and no. They employed her, I think, a total of 5 or 6 times. She wrote later on to Mary Soames and said, she gave her a list of when she'd worked for them. And it was the odd weekend, it was a holiday cover for their normal cook, and it was being brought in for special occasions when they really wanted to impress people. But they couldn't really afford her. She commanded higher wages than they could give. And I think what happened was when you got to the war, she sort of thought, well, okay, hang on, I've been through one of these before, it wasn't great for cooks. All the aristocracy are going to shut the houses up. There aren't going to be any more debutante balls or suppers. I need to go and find someone to work for who's going to have a job. And it sort of came down, I suspect, to Lord Halifax or Winston Churchill, because they were the ones that were right. So she wrote to them and offered her services. And Clementine Churchill, who later wrote the foreword for Georgina's cookery book, said she was overjoyed to have her. And you do get the feeling that that was a real sentiment, because she just knew that everything would be fine. Georgina would just work it out, and she wouldn't have to worry, which clearly they had done an awful lot before. Because, I mean, how do you kind of run a country and entertain kings? Georgina said she'd cooked for 16 monarchs. How do you do that if your staff keeps leaving? So actually, this was a massive coup, but it worked both ways, because the churches were also Georgina's longest serving employers. So that relationship, I think, was one that was very, very important, not just for them, but also for her. And there's a lot of sort of, there's this idea that servants didn't have agency and that they couldn't leave, and that somehow there's a lot of this kind of anti-servant idea still, I think, either that or everyone's in Downton Abbey. And the truth, of course, is that domestic service employed more women than any other profession. So it's a huge area, but certainly looking at Georgina, she had agency, she knew what she was doing, and she did quite adroitly manage her career, and that, I think, included going to go and work for the Churchills.
And of course, she managed that very well, because by the end of the war, she's working for arguably the most famous man in the world.
Exactly, and she's doing what she wants to do. And later on, she called it her war work and said that she felt that she had contributed manifestly to Churchill's life and career by being the person that cooked for him. And of course, there's the story where he comes off the balcony after he's done his victory speech and turns around and sees her and ushers her onto the balcony at all those crowds and says, "I couldn't have done it without you." And that, to her, was the culmination of everything. So. And I think, for both of them, there was that real moment when they did mean it.
So, of course, it's really in the 1930s that Mrs. Landemare and the Churchills sort of first come together. And we have here a menu book from, I think, 1936, 1937, where you can just start to see her involvement in their kitchen.
Yeah, I mean, she's cooked for them on a couple of weekends before, but this was the book that kind of made me realise this was okay. Because at that point it was difficult to find out enough to tell her story, and also I think enough to keep me interested as a researcher. You're kind of doing this thing and you think, but I want there to be a point. I've got engaged with this character. I want there to, and then suddenly you go from, supper, baked beans on toast, potatoes, beetroot salad, baked apples and cream, to this characteristic. The second I saw that, I thought, this is Georgina, she's arrived, she's here. And you've got it all in French, so œuf écarlate and épaule d'agneau, légumes, gâteau de riz. I mean, it's not that sophisticated. Œuf écarlate have got, I think they normally have truffles, but also coxcombs and maybe tongue to make the sort of scarlet on the egg. And you've got a shoulder of lamb and vegetables. Gâteau de riz is a rice pudding. With an apple puree. So actually when you render it in English, it's not that sophisticated, but she's French trained. She's grown up in British kitchens, but her husband was French. She's very conversant with French food, which is the fashionable stuff. And when you get to dinner, consommé, not quite readable, Ferrand, possibly Fernand, filet de sole murat, faisan hongroise, glace andalouse, and canapé. And you just think, actually, doesn't it just sounds so much better.
And of course, this is also what Winston Churchill would have grown up with as well, because this was very much the style in the Victorian and Edwardian period.
I mean, you had a French menu, even if you had an English cook, which Jenny Churchill did most of the time, although she always prized her cookery staff more than others. So she had 5 in the kitchen, which is quite unusual for someone of her wealth level. So yes, all of Winston's menus growing up would have been in French. There would have been more courses than this as well. You're looking at 7 to 9 for the Edwardian period, or I think 26 at Blenheim, but that's a bit excessive. And this is 100% Edwardian. Georgina's food, I think, was very much the style that he was used to. So she trained in the Edwardian era. She was virtually his contemporary. She first made cook when she was 25 in 1905. So very, very, very close to sort of exactly how his life maps out. And although she changed the style of cooking to suit the 1930s, where more international dishes came in and where foods were more seasonal and fresher and just a little bit less aspic, to be honest with you. So she had changed the style in which she cooked, and doubtless he had changed the style in which she ate. But, someone from 1912 could have sat down to that menu and gone, oh yeah, now I totally get what's going on here, this is fine. And I think that's one of the things that's quite useful to remember. The other thing about this book is that all of the scribbles, these bits are very obviously Clementine Churchill's handwriting, but when you really go through it with a kind of detailed eye, you realise she's put page annotations, so Floating Island 203, beef page 85, and you think, well, what do they relate to? And then you realise 203, and when you puzzle out the initials there, it's MGF, which is More Good Food by Ambrose Heath. And so when you go through the pages of this, there are 4 or 5 books that we know she had, and when you turn to those pages, the recipes are there, so you can say with certitude, this is exactly the food that Winston Churchill was eating on this particular day, and that was being cooked by this chef, and that's quite unusual for any historic character, really. You can often find menus, but you don't know what the dish is and which recipe was being used, whereas for these, you can tell exactly. And you know, that's pretty unusual for a researcher, and it's quite a special thing to be able to say, to be honest.
And how typical then was Clementine's library of the time?
Fairly typical, swayed by the fact that she had family who wrote cookery books. So 2 of the books in there are by Dorothy Alhusen, who I think was her cousin, a medley of recipes, and also Scents and Dishes, which is a beautiful book. It's got this kind of gold cover that looks like dyed ostrich skin. And those books were pulled together by Alhusen, and she asked her friends for recipes. So Clementine, this is another one of these sort of, you follow this tiny little rabbit hole down and then you get into something that's beautiful. So Dorothy Alhusen has got in her cookery book a recipe given by Clementine Churchill, which was her mother's recipe for a chocolate cake. That chocolate cake appears almost verbatim in Georgina Landemare's cookery book as published. I cooked it for the archive here, and it's really good. I mean, like, really good.
We can testify to this. You talked about cooking during the Second World War and the issues with rationing and sort of bending the ration. And of course, we've got a very good example of that here. This label relates to 8 partridges that were sent by the King to Winston Churchill. Presuming, yes, from the estate at Sandringham.
I just think it's brilliant the way so many things didn't make it to the archive, like all the earlier menu books. But yet luggage labels that were attached to the necks of dead birds did make it to the archive. So these things are just fantastic. And they're the kind of things that I suspect a lot of people wouldn't, you kind of look at them and think, what do I do with these? And then all of a sudden, for me, I was like, well, I know exactly what to do with them. But they're just fantastic that they survive and that they do give you this real picture of things constantly arriving. And when you start to read the list of gifts that are given, it is constant. I mean, there's a box of oranges that comes across on a US Air Force plane, or there's, you know, this packet of sugar that's been sent from someone. Oh, and then there's these grouse, and then so-and-so sends this. And so much so that eventually they have to ban gifts because it's all getting a bit embarrassing. And also because there's a fear someone might poison Winston Churchill.
Exactly, I was about to say, I mean, with his cigars, they actually bring in MI5 to test some of these gifts.
Don't they feed them to dogs or something?
Well, they boil the cigars down into a broth, which they feed to mice. And when no ill befalls the mice, these poor scientists have to stand there with the cigar broth on their tongue. And when no ill befalls them, the cigar is deemed safe. But by that point, of course, it's been destroyed.
You're not smoking it then, are you,
no.
really?
But did you found similar things with the food as well?
I think my favourite one was Stilton Gate, which was... Sometimes when you're sitting in an archive and you're giggling, other people do give you slightly strange looks. So there's a Mr. Goulburn of Manchester, and Mr. Goulburn sent Winston Churchill half a Stilton Christmas, I think 1940. And obviously it got eaten because Winston Churchill and most of his family loved Stilton, and he normally ended meal with Stilton. And then somebody wrote to the Ministry of Food saying, disgusting, Mr. Goulburn of Manchester has a sign in his shop window saying there's a cheese as eaten by Mr. Churchill. Of course it's fine if miners are going to have cheese, but Mr. Churchill is hardly a miner. So, of course, they dispatched someone to go and find out what's going on because this is their worst nightmare. They thought it was a gift. They didn't think it was advertising. It's all a bit sort of influencer. And before they get there, the shop is bombed. So they never get to find out exactly what's going on. But in the wake of that, they have to sort of pass this edict, which is no more unsolicited gifts will be accepted. I mean, it clearly didn't do them any harm because Mr. Goulburn sent him another, I can't remember who sent him after the war. I don't think it says in the sort of thank you note what got sent, but Goulburn clearly sent something and was sent a book in return to say thank you. So, you know, in some ways, I would say you do read some of this and you think the man is incorrigible. There's nothing he won't accept, including water softeners from the Per Uit water softener company. And I mean, everything is coming in and he's like, yep, bring it on, I'm going to eat it.
And of course that continues after the war with birthdays, anniversaries.
Yeah, it's just...
and you can see here a list of Christmas gifts from 1962. But you can certainly see a theme emerging in these. Yep. I mean, the Stilton is back. Oh, yeah. But also pâté, cigars.
Branded cherries, grapefruit. I mean, who wouldn't want grapefruit for Christmas? And quite frankly, you know, wow, 2 cases of Black Label. Yep. From Johnny Walker themselves. And it is, you've got corporations that are sending things because they think it will do them no harm, and also because genuinely people do want to send things to this man who now is this kind of living legend. But then you also, what I think surprised me was the individuals that sent things. So families who would just say, well, for goodness sake, if you were still in charge, it wouldn't be like it is now. Here, have some, whatever it was. And it kind of brought home to you, I think, that a lot of this stuff was played out at a very high level, behind closed doors or in the Commons or in the pages of documents and in the pages of people's correspondence. But yet you really do have this genuine groundswell of feeling afterwards. And I mean, there's this of the Christmas presents they sent out as well, which was largely cash. And I mean, there's pages and pages of these things. It's a really salutary reminder as to why Chartwell is so crammed with stuff. Nothing ever got thrown away either. Some things got re-gifted. Georgina has a tray, a sort of wooden tray that's now in the Cabinet War Rooms that was given to her probably by Frank Sawyers, who may or may not have filched it, according to Georgina's granddaughter, but might also have been given it. So some things do get re-gifted. And you do, it's insane. And you see it, I think, with anybody at a high level. I studied Queen Victoria at one point, and she had storerooms full of just absolute crap that she'd bought on holiday or been given, just sort of random figures of donkeys and things. So it surprises me, to be honest, that there's not more room at Chartwell, just full of stuff. Mainly food, but I suppose they ate everything that's there. So probably not the arrangement of plants.
And then, of course, you know, you come on to the legacy, which I suppose we're already touching on in a way with these sort of post-war gifts. But here you have Mary Soames, Mary Churchill as was, corresponding with Mrs. Landemare in the late 1960s after her father's death. She now knows that she is going to be writing the biography of her mother, Clementine, and she's throwing herself into the research. And as part of that research, she is contacting the key people who worked for her parents and posing them various questions. And you can see here the sort of sheet of questions that she poses to Georgina. I mean, presumably this was very useful for you.
This was invaluable, and I found it right at the end because I was going through things chronologically. And when I was researching as well, the Mary Soames archive wasn't entirely open, so I was sort of riding the crest of a wave, as it were. But I mean, 1968, by this point, Georgina had retired. She was living with her daughter in a kind of granny annex that was built over the garage, and she'd been living with her brother for a while as well, with a misogynistic parrot. But by then she was living with her daughter, and I think you get an impression of her in old age where she was very content on one level. She had grandchildren she was devoted to. She was living with her daughter who she had a complex relationship with. But on another level, she was incredibly upset and depressed because she'd stopped working through ill health in the 1950s. She'd been forced into stopping working, and she lived until 1978. So she spent a long time in retirement with a lot of friends, loads of correspondence, but really missing the Churchills, missing being at the centre of things and missing cooking for them. She remained good friends with Clementine. Clementine used to turn up and visit her, and they'd eat chocolate cake. And I think Clementine once offered her a colour television, which had to be put off because at the time the house was Labour HQ, so they thought it was not a great point for her to turn up. So this letter which she writes back to Mary is, you know, you read it and actually I found it quite sort of touching because she's just, I'm so pleased you've written to you. And I'm so pleased you're writing Lady Churchill's life, and of course I'm going to answer all your questions. And they correspond quite regularly. But finding this and realising that Mary's research was fabulous, and also that she'd contacted people who now we have no way of contacting and whose lives are, in some cases, very difficult to recover. I mean, this document, it kind of has all the answers, really. And,
you know, she really became a celebrity in old age. I mean, she was interviewed, she did television interviews.
And everybody knew her name. Yeah. And when you look through the archive, it says things like, Mrs. Landemare says your cheese was very nice. And it's, yeah.
How, when she was reflecting back on her time at Number 10, how accurate was she?
It's very difficult to tell because of the fact that the records are so incomplete. I think she was very accurate. She started to write a memoir when she was in her 90s. Grace Hamblin persuaded her that her life was very valuable and this should be a memoir. So she started to write down everything. And then it was a horrible time at home. Her daughter had breast cancer. Her son-in-law was dying. It was absolutely horrific. And she decided her life wasn't worth anything. And so she tore her memoir up and she put it down the plug hole. And her granddaughter saved, I think there's 19 pages of it, and it is absolutely bang on accurate. I couldn't believe how accurate it was for a time period. You know, she was writing about life when she was 7, 8, 9. It sort of stops when she's 13, but everything I could verify in that memoir was absolutely spot on, even down to the third-class carriages going through the cutting in outside Tame, so not Tame, Oldbury area where she lived. It would have been the 1850s. She talked about that, so her mother's recollections. So I've got no reason to think that her recollections of working for the Churchills were not accurate. She did, of course, self-edit. She was outraged by the negativity surrounding Churchill. She was incensed when the stuff about his stroke came out. She really was very, very loyal to the family. But there's a brief, I think it's a 5-minute interview with her, which was done for Times Remembered in the 1970s, where she talks about her time, and her memory is absolutely crystal clear. So I have no reason to think that she was remembering inaccurately. She may well not have talked about. Apparently she used to get occasionally a bit drunk on sherry in the old people's home and tell stories. So the one story she always told was Churchill saying, "What is the ration anyway?" So she, who brought him his breakfast, laid out the ration on a tray and brought it up and showed it to him, and he said, "You know, it's not bad, is that, for a day?" And she said, "Yeah, it's for a week." And that story gets told a lot, but usually without her in it, which incensed me because it's her story. You know, why would you make a papier-mâché model of the ration when it's downstairs in the kitchen, kind of thing? But that was really the only story she'd tell. She occasionally did say that she used to sort of tell Mr. Churchill to stop running around the house naked and things. So she was very intertwined. But I think she did look back with joy, and she looked back with a sense of satisfaction at her life as well. And when I came to the end of the book, I started writing it because I thought it would be a useful way and a good way to write about 20th century food. And then I thought, actually, Churchill's an interesting character in and of his own right, but very few people have written about his domestic life, and that's something I'd quite like to do. And I want to write about a strong woman who made it, and domestic service is really important, and so many of us have ancestors in service that Georgina's life is kind of the life of many of our grandparents. But by the time I finished it, I wanted to write about Georgina Landemare, and I wanted to tell her story and triumph of her. And I think if any of us can get to our late 90s and look back and say, I lived my life, I have no regrets, I mean, for goodness sake, you can't ask for more, can you?